and encryption. The first talk in our session this afternoon will be from Erica Portnoy, who is a senior staff technologist at the EFF.
Hey. Aha. Hello, everyone here. Welcome from lunch. Hopefully you'll be able to stay awake for this talk. I'll try to keep it exciting. So today I'm going to be talking about encryption policy and how it fits into the broader policy landscape and how that affects what we as engineers and cryptographers do and how we need to think about our work. So we'll start by talking about authoritarianism and what that looks like when it's made into policy, explaining how authoritarians create social control by restricting and criminalizing what they see as social deviance, and how this is all done in the name of protecting children.
Can you please share the slides?
To more explicitly limit access to the internet for kids, and thereby control their access to their social life. Then we'll see where encryption comes in, and how for those set on controlling things, private messages have to be controlled as well. And then we'll conclude with talking about why this all matters directly to us here in this room, and what we can do about it. Now, before we get into it, this is a little different from some of the other talks we've heard these past couple of days, in that I'm going to be talking about some hard topics, and I'm not going to be offended if anybody needs to leave the room at the beginning or later or for any reason, because I know this can be some hard things to hear about. Certainly, I felt that while I was making the talk. So, like I said, we're going to start with talking about authoritarianism and what that looks like in practice when it's made into policy. Basically, the thesis of the authoritarians is that deviance is the enemy of societal function. Therefore, if you see any deviance out in the world, you have to try to limit it and control it to keep your society functioning. In much of what we're seeing with authoritarianism today, there's this belief that society has gone mad and we have to protect the future by restoring control, otherwise everything is going to be lost. To be authoritarian fundamentally means believing that the authorities in charge are the ones who know that's best. So as a consequence, this can mean that law enforcement needs to have access to absolutely everything in all cases so that they can handle everything because they're the ones in charge, even if it treads on other rights like privacy. It can also apply in the more closed context, in the sense of a family, where the parents are the one who should have control over every aspect of their kids' lives, but they derive from the same fundamental underlying principles. So what does this look like in practice when it turns into public policy and law? I'm going to use some examples of anti-trans laws in the US, because that's where I'm based, so it's the ones that I know best. And in the US, we have seen things lately like banning gender-affirming care and criminalizing the doctors who provide it, but also things like banning drag in public and investigating parents who provide trans care to their kids as child abusers. And it's not just a few states, it's a widespread and growing problem. I, in fact, had to update this slide between when I started making the talk and now, because it changed so much just in that short time. Now, a couple of the states did get better, going into the more blue category, but unfortunately, 3 of them got redder. Thank you to Texas for being some of the worst ones out there, but actually thank you to Minnesota for having great laws providing refugees that happened pretty recently as well. So we can start to see how this is relevant to encryption by looking at how the proponents of these laws defend them. Basically, it's often the classic protect the children line, which in this case here, this quote becomes the phrase gender-confused, vulnerable children. It would be humorously absurd if it weren't so effective as rhetoric. And it is, in fact, just rhetoric that they're using. It's not like they actually believe that they're protecting these confused children or anything. This is a quote from someone who used to be involved in the movement but then got out of it, talking about how protecting the children is very explicitly within the community known to be a front for damaging the trans community, when in fact, really, they just want to do as much damage to the community as they can. And different authoritarian movements are directly connected. So just when you're talking about anti-trans movements, you can see that they're connected to things like the anti-abortion movement as well, by looking at the people behind them. It's literally the same exact groups who are forefronting these movements. Some of the classic ones are the Alliance Defending Freedom and the misleadingly named American College of Pediatricians, which is nothing to do with the best practices for pediatricians. And the anti-abortion laws have been spreading rapidly as well since Roe v. Wade was just overturned last year. So all of these places that have restrictive anti-abortion laws managed to do this in just over a year, which is ridiculously fast. And anti-abortion is also pretty digital too already. And even in just 1 year, they're even further ahead of the anti-trans laws in terms of restricting access to information. So we could start to see how these policies impinge on the digital sphere in practice. In Texas, like I mentioned before, they have this ridiculous bounty hunter law where not just having or performing abortions, but even aiding them makes you a target to be sued. That includes providing basic educational resources, sharing information, identifying locations of clinics, arranging rides and escorts, fundraising to support reproductive rights, or even just encouraging women to get abortions. All of these can get you sued in Texas, even if you didn't actually manage to help someone get an abortion. Now, I've drawn these examples from the US where I live, but it's, of course, happening outside as well. So to pick on Hungary, we can look at this law that they passed that lets LGBTQ content be linked directly to child abuse in the law rather than just in the rhetoric. So in 2021, Hungary passed this law saying that you can't show minors any content portraying being gay or transgender. And the way they did it is they stuck it into an amendment to a bill fighting child abuse more generally. So when you're charged with reading a children's book about a trans unicorn or whatever, the law that you'll be charged under is actually a child abuse law rather than something specific to being queer. Yeah, so this is some pretty horrible stuff happening in the world that I know when I was looking into a lot of the details to prepare this made me pretty stressed. So just take a little breather here, take a second. Look at my very cute bunny. Wow, she's great. And she's not doing anything horrible. Okay, so we talked about this trend of authoritarians reigning in social deviance, and we started to talk about how this relates to kids and online content. Now we'll look at some pushes to more explicitly limit access to the internet for kids. So why is the internet dangerous from an authoritarian perspective? Basically, it's because the internet is where ideas spread. It's both a social sphere and it provides access to information. So you can keep kids in their suburban home and ban books from schools and libraries, but if they have internet access, they'll still be doing things out there beyond your direct control, which of course authoritarians hate. And direct control is necessary from an authoritarian perspective. And this is because authoritarians see children as objects of protection rather than fully formed subjects of rights. There's a lot of fear-mongering around the internet for kids and social media in particular, but as with most moral panics, it's mostly unfounded, and it turns out the internet is actually mostly great for kids. Here's this Pew study from 2022 as just one example. So for most kids, the internet lets them connect to their friends, show their creative side, get support, and feel accepted. And you can imagine how it's even more important for kids who are marginalized or otherwise unwelcome in their daily lives to be able to have access to this sort of community. But the fears driving the push to limit the internet for kids have the same underlying principles as the anti-abortion and anti-trans movements, which is that the answer to everything is surveillance and control. So now let's take a look at some of the proposals out there that are trying to implement this control. These all tend to be horrible in a whole variety of ways beyond their underlying principles. So the Kids Online Safety Act nearly made it into a must-pass package last legislative session. Not only does it include overbroad language about what it limits for kids using this line, other matters that pose a risk to physical and mental health of a minor, it lets individual states decide what falls into that category. Even beyond what we saw in the last section about how states are quickly moving to limit trans and abortion rights, this is especially worrying when you consider that one of the sponsors of the bill has referred to education about race discrimination as being dangerous for kids. Then there's a bunch of state bills that instead use the tactic of giving parents or guardians excessive and direct control over their kids' online experience, with the Utah one being the worst of them. Now, this bill is wild. First of all, kids can mean anyone under 18. So you have the 17-year-old who's being subject to these laws, and the limitations that they impose are ridiculous. So a 17-year-old under this law would not be able to use the internet after 10:30 p.m. And if kids want to have an online account on most websites, the bill requires that the parents be given the password. And of course, to implement this, it includes an age verification requirement. So you can't just lie about your age on the internet, as people have been doing since the dawn of time. And instead, you have to trust these companies that you say are causing harm and have privacy problems with the kids' identification information. So, it's a little silly for them to be doing this in the first place. These are only a couple of the proposals out there, and these are the ones that don't directly touch on encryption, which we'll look at more in the next section. And in case you're exhausted by all these laws, I know somebody who relates. Okay, so if you want to have social control, you'll restrict and criminalize what you see as social deviance, often in the name of kids, and then go on to limit access to information for kids more directly. But now we get to where encryption comes in. If you're set on controlling things, surely the private messages must be controlled as well. So how can we let messages be private, uncontrolled space when they might harbor content that's dangerous for children or to society at large? Now, of course, attacking private messages is not anything new. Since encryption is what allows messages to be truly private, encryption is the part of it that gets targeted. Since encryption is knowledge and knowledge is power, encryption takes power away from authorities, and so therefore, encryption is inherently anti-authoritarian. But given the storied history of the crypto wars, authorities usually can't just come out and say that they want to backdoor encryption. So instead, they'll find the best excuse that they have, which today means focusing on stopping online child abuse, as they claim. But something that anyone who works on child abuse knows is that in nearly all cases, the abuse is perpetrated by someone the child already knows. So for it to make sense at all to come after encryption, proposals really have to focus narrowly on the resharing of child sexual abuse material, otherwise known as CSAM. It's because no logical informed person looking at abuse more broadly, who isn't already starting from an encryption-focused perspective, could possibly understand how this abuse is perpetrated and then decide to go after encryption of all things. And young people themselves don't want this surveillance as an answer. When you consider kids as fully formed subjects of rights, you might start to ask what kids themselves think, and that is exactly what European digital rights did. They interviewed 8,000 teenagers in 13 EU countries, and they found that the kids themselves don't want government scanning, even if it's to prevent child abuse. The kids they surveyed said they wouldn't be comfortable being politically active or exploring their sexuality if authorities were monitoring their digital communications. So even though the law might want to target child abuse, by adding surveillance, they're effectively chilling political activity and sexual exploration, which, again, is going to make authoritarians very happy. But don't worry, they'll say these days, we're not even breaking encryption. You might trace this trend back to the 2015 speech, which asks for encryption front doors. But the first major proposal of this sort was the UK's Ghost proposal in 2019, which would basically add your surveiller as a secret, silent, extra group child member. Priti Patel was the Home Secretary at the time, but given changeover in the UK, this is graphics a little out of date. Anyway, so thinking that this doesn't break encryption is a fallacy arising from poorly defined endpoints. And if you're interested in a more rigorous treatment of it, you could see the paper on end-to-end encryption, which you can find on ePrim. But for an intuitive understanding of why this breaks encryption, you can think about user expectations. In a securely encrypted system, no one but you or your intended recipients should be able to read or make inferences on the messages you send. Things like the Ghost proposal or today's common client-side scanning proposals, which do the scanning before messages leave the device, break that expectation. But lawmakers, of course, don't care and are going ahead and mandating this stuff anyway. The UK wants to scan everything, and furthermore, they want to also criminalize sending messages even intended to cause psychological harm. Even if no harm was actually caused in the UK, as long as there was a risk it might have, you still might get 2 years jail time. Not only do websites have to proactively prevent harmful content, they have to use officially government-approved software to do the scanning. Now, if you've heard of this bill, these are probably the parts that you've heard of. But this bill is so extensive that while they were at it, they also created this new offense where you might get a year in jail for lying online, which wasn't even the top story. The EU also wants to scan everything, but in the EU, they focus more on detecting things we don't actually have the technology to detect. In addition to requiring private content scanning, The EU Child Sexual Abuse Regulation, commonly known as chat control, would make websites proactively try to find previously unseen abusive content. Plus, it wants websites to use AI to look at message threads and determine if the conversation involves grooming for future child abuse. Again, focusing on this stranger danger fear instead of looking at the vast majority of cases of grooming that are perpetrated by someone the kid already knows. Of course, the US won't be left out. They want to scan everything too. Under this law, the fact that you support encryption at all on your service can be used as evidence against you. And they're not even pretending to be okay with encryption here. The sponsors of this bill have just come out and said that they don't want encryption to be a get-out-of-jail-free card. And they all want to mandate this, despite the technology barely even working for the already narrow types of child abuse cases it might even theoretically work for. These reports that get made have tons of false positives. Facebook found that 3/4 of reports are things like bad jokes. LinkedIn found that only 1/3 of their reports were actually CSAM. And even the confirmed reports are rarely acted on. A 2020 report from Ireland showed that only 10% are even actionable in the first place. And those don't even all get followed up on. So it's not like getting more reports by breaking encryption and increasing the size of the haystack is going to help things. And like a 2022 New York Times article showed, where they were talking about a couple of fathers falsely flagged as child abusers because they sent medical pictures of their kids to their doctors, these false positives can have a giant effect on your online social life that lasts and lasts. And that's because companies cannot afford to take this risk of being shown not to be harsh enough against any of the positives that they flag because the laws are so harsh. So earlier we talked about all the different types of social deviance that authoritarians are against. These anti-encryption bills often mandate scanning only for CSAM in particular, but it's naive to think that authoritarians won't see this technology, see that it's already deployed, and mandate scanning for broader varieties of content. We know it because we've already seen it happen. The technology that was originally developed to scan for CSAM is already today being used to scan for terrorist content. And when a place considers wearing drag akin to terrorism or child abuse, and there's this technology available, they're not going to have any qualms about mandating those scans as well, instead of just relying on empowered bounty hunters to report their neighbors. Even more directly, the term grooming has already been used to attack queer adults. So when laws pass that allow scanning for grooming, you can see how they'll be interpreted to scan for queer content online as well, super easily. So yeah, I gotta be skeptical of the utility of any of these proposals. Okay, so we've talked about what the laws are and what's driving them. Now let's talk about why this matters to us here in this room and what we're going to do about it. So the first thing to keep in mind is you can't assume any of these proposals are made in good faith. Therefore, these proposals don't deserve your efforts in trying to make everyone happy. Split the difference and let them have their surveillance and have their encryption too. So a myth that I often hear is if we don't offer a less bad alternative, they'll just do the worst possible thing. I am here to tell you, backed up by my crack team of legislative analysis and legal experts, that is just not true. That is not how this works. Things that are important to basic rights can in fact be uncompromisingly protected. Just because policymakers don't like hearing, just don't legislate, that doesn't mean it's not the right answer. And it doesn't mean that we can't get that result. It is in fact possible to convince a lawmaker of something, and it happens all the time. So for example, there could be somebody out there who thinks that we need to scan for CSAM, but at the same time understands why you might not want to be scanning for abortion content. So when you explain that it's the same technology that would be used for both of these things, you can get them to back off. And if they're telling you that you have to pick one, they're taking advantage of you not knowing how the system works. So learn how the system works, and you won't be fooled into doing that. Okay, now that we won't all get tricked into thinking that we need to design these things, the next step is not getting nerd-type. Do not let this be you. Now I know computation over encrypted data is very cool and very fun, but when it's a backdoor that does not matter how fun it is, it's still assessing private content and reporting it to a third party, which is breaking encryption. So if you have to work on this topic because it's just so fun, consider using it to limit rather than open access to data. Data that used to be sent in the clear but really needs to be computed on can now be encrypted, rather than protected data being computed on and releasing more information out there. Or you can go do this work in another less sensitive field like health data or something to let researchers work on it. But just don't design a system that will automatically reveal people's private information just because there's cool crypto involved in building it. So for those of you building non-backdoored encryption, first of all, thank you. But remember the old adage that done is better than perfect. So it's politically easier to defend an encryption product that's already been shipped than try to add encryption later. And if these laws pass, it'll just get even harder. Just be sure when you're doing this not to make overbroad claims about your encryption protections that can get users in trouble when they rely on them and expect higher encryption than you actually offer. But if you can get something out the door ASAP, do that. Okay, so if there's one slide in this entire talk that I want you to remember, it is this one right here. Remember, it is not just what you work on, it's how you talk about what you work on. So this is a room here of people who understand subtlety and nuance and the details of security and encryption, and the trade-offs involved in encryption, like security and usability, right? That's why we're all here. Unfortunately, politicians do not have that luxury. They might work on encryption one day and standardized testing and requirements the next. And even their technical staffers have to be more generalists, so someone might be in charge of all of science policy. They're doing the biology work and the encryption work at the same time. So when they hear something like, it is technically possible to build such a system, they think, great, that means we can now legislate to require it. The concept of it is technically possible, but has such limitations that it's infeasible to ship, it just doesn't exist for them. You have to think about it like another language. And in this language that they speak, they don't have time for these long phrases. So if you want to say that in their language, what you say instead is a single word. It's impossible. And I know that's not like technically accurate, but it hurts a little less if you think about it as just speaking a little language, and the words in this other language have this other meaning. It's hard to do, but it's really necessary. And speaking this language fluently matters because we are the ones that they look to answer these questions. So it's not just that we need to say it right, we do need to be out there saying it at all. Just because they don't understand technology, it will not stop them from legislating on it, unfortunately. So unless we make it clear that there's no way to nerd harder to make encryption backdoors, they're going to pass the laws to require them. An easy way to speak up is through the EFF Action Center, whose link is on this slide, where you can mention in your messages to representatives that you work on these technologies. A harder, but potentially more impactful way is to get your company to take a public stance. But both of these are still less hard than being stuck in a complex regulatory framework where nobody knows what's illegal in the first place. And so then your general counsel just says, oh, no, we can't risk building this. So if you want encryption to remain legal, please let your voice be heard. That's not easy, but we haven't lost yet. By speaking up now, we can and will defend encryption. And one more bonus way to help out is to enable EFF's lawyers, activists, and technologists to defend encryption every day, which you can do at this link here. Again, I'm Erica Portnoy. Thank you for listening today, and I think we have time for some questions.
All right, so one question to get us started. You mentioned that it is easier to, it's better, sorry, done is better than perfect.
Mm-hmm.
It's good if we have things in now because it's harder to remove them later. So there are areas where you think we are missing pieces of encryption technology that we should be focusing on first.
Oh yeah, definitely. And I mean, I feel like we've seen some of them highlighted just in previous talks in this conference. There was a whole talk about how encrypting cloud backup storage is difficult, right? The mega talk, I believe it was. And so that's a big area of improvement that we can do. It's hard, but it's not impossible, right? If you look at the way that WhatsApp did it, now Apple iCloud has their backups encrypted as well. Like these things are possible to do, even if they're hard. But now that there's more examples out there, you don't have to design all of your UX from scratch. So hopefully that should make it a little easier. I think that's the next big area to look at is all these backups in the cloud. Yeah.
Can you just go back one slide, I think? With 2 slides before the rabbit.
Probably.
One more. I was just going to just react to this. I mean, I totally understand where you're coming from, but I just want to say that, you know, encouraging scientists to lie is a very slippery slope, and it's why in the US half the country no longer respects science. So you just have to be very, very careful with the messaging, and I totally understand what you said, speaking a different language. Yeah, I understand that, but does everybody, you know, do non-scientists understand that? And it causes a lot of problems also.
Well, I mean, you don't really have to think of it as lying per se, right?
No, you don't, but will somebody listening to you think of it as lying?
It's only, no, it's only lying if you don't understand all the things that aren't being said. So it's not just that you're saying each of these things. In languages, words have connotations, so they have further meaning. So impossible and infeasible in politician speak are equivalent. So if you're trying to say infeasible, you need to say impossible, because infeasible is just not the word that they use for that. So impossible to build in the real world under these constraints, it's just a shorter way of saying it. It's an abbreviation rather than a lie, I think is the way to think
I think
about
the
it.
slide is fine, but I'm worried where it goes 5 years from now.
I think these are not quite the dangers there.
So my question is, you mentioned about, you know, communicating effectively to the legislative process and how, you know, technology will be legislated. Like, even in advance of that, we've seen things like before, you know, Apple maintained the lack of end-to-end encryption for government, at the government's request. It was reported by Reuters. And it's been reported widely that even with the end-to-end encryption backups for WhatsApp, that WhatsApp is still available for law enforcement surveillance, even though it's theoretically end-to-end encrypted. And we haven't seen any like backdoor legislation yet. We've seen proposals and things like this, but like, do we really think that the biggest threat is from legislation versus the actual people implementing this today to enable surveillance inside of these companies that run these systems?
What do you mean by implementing it today? Like,
so like, for example, like, you know, iCloud has just recently announced end-to-end encryption, but it's off by default, and the backups for historically have been maintained as not end-to-end encrypted to enable surveillance. And WhatsApp is still available for surveillance to law enforcement, even though it's theoretically end-to-end encrypted. The same goes for iMessage. And we've seen this, like with, you know, the people that participate in PRISM for bulk or for targeted collection. These companies today are shipping what is headline news, end-to-end encrypted, that is able to be surveilled by the state.
Yeah, I mean, so I mean, I think the WhatsApp, right? So when you see those headlines, right? Anytime you look at the details, it always ends up being like a targeted case. And I feel like everybody understands that at the end of the day, if you really want to get into one specific person's phone, there's going to eventually be some way to do that. But that's a very different situation from considering mass surveillance.
Certainly, but like, to use your example, like you could target all the abortion providers in a city, right? Like if the state can compel these people to surveil what's quote unquote end to end, then they can surveil anyone that the state decides that they deem undesirable, right?
I mean, but that's certainly much easier to do on an unencrypted service. So we're talking about abortion, right? We've already seen that they requested Facebook hand over messages. So.
I think the danger is like from the implementers, not from the state.
Yeah, I mean, it's the scale of it, right? It's going to scale person by person when they do it, and it's going to require a lot of work. So you can't just have them require all the abortion providers to go say hack all the abortion providers is very different from hack this one specific person and watch until they leave their laptop unattended, right? That requires a lot more effort and a lot more time. And so I think the scale of it is really where the difference comes in. Yeah.
Hi, great talk. What do you say to the people who go, this is nice, but that's a completely extreme position. We can't do that. You have to do something. Because that is a line of reasoning I hear frequently. And I was curious if you have a sort of explicit.
Yeah, I mean, the thing you have to understand about we have to do something is hiring in politics doesn't work like hiring in tech or academia or wherever. The way you get hired in politics is you get elected. And politicians, to get reelected, they need to be constantly seen to be doing things. It doesn't really matter what the things are. So, when they're saying we have to do something, it doesn't mean we have to do something about encryption from their perspective. They just have to keep doing things. So I feel like that's just a line they use,
So on the political side, I agree with you. This is a question for the people who are working on the technical stuff, the backdoor encryption, if you will, right? Where it's like, well, great, like there is this extremist positions of like me and you and the EFF, and then they're like, but we have to deal with this stuff, so we're not going to sit at the bottom left of that slide there.
Yeah.
We're going to go somewhere else. And I don't know, what would you say to the room full of people with that opinion?
I mean, it really depends why they're saying it, right? I feel like you have to look at why they're saying we must do something. And that's where, their arguments start to fall apart, right? What are they saying we have to do something about? Are they saying we really need this mass surveillance system and we need to be able to get into everybody's phone out on a whim or whatever? There shouldn't be any, if they're saying, I feel like, I think it is a very specific answer to the person who's saying something. But to be a little generalist here, when they're saying that, they're saying it because, they want access to everything everywhere, and they think that they should be able to access all of that. But that is not how societies are constructed, right? We have the social contract. There are limits that we place on the authorities, even if it means that we don't have a perfect policing, right? That's when you become a police state, right? In the US, we have the Fourth Amendment. You can't just go into somebody's home willy-nilly at any second, right? There's restrictions and limitations around this, and we as a society accept that we are going to have these restrictions and limitations to be able to preserve some of the civil rights. So when they say, oh, we have to do something, we have to be able to get into it, that's the rhetoric they use to convince you, but it's not the contract that we've made as a society.
No. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
I'm afraid we've run out of
question,
time, so
thanks.
please join me in thanking Erica again.
Thank you.
Our next speakers will be Matteo Scarlata and Ken Tong Trong, who will be talking about an analysis of the Threema secure messenger.
All right. So, hello everyone, I'm Kian, and this talk is titled Analysis of the Threema Secure Messenger. This is a joint work between Kenny Patterson, Matteo Scarlata here, and myself. We are from the Applied Cryptography group at ETH Zurich. So, first of all, let's ask ourselves, what is Threema? So, Threema describes itself as an end-to-end encrypted messaging application for Android and iOS. And it was released in 2012, so to put a little bit of context, this is before Signals was released and before WhatsApp was end-to-end encrypted. And they take a lot of pride in being Swiss. Indeed, in their website, they say that Threema is 100% Swiss-made. Unlike US services, it is fully GDPR compliant. And we all know nothing shady related to cryptography ever came out of Switzerland. So that said, why is this an interesting target? So the question is, who uses Threema? Well, 11 million private users worldwide, as well as various organizations and political entities. For example, the Swiss government and the Swiss army mandate the usage of Threema as the messages of choice for internal communications. And allegedly, Olaf Scholz, the current chancellor of Germany, also uses Threema. Well, this makes it an interesting target for the analysis. And I'm just going to give you like a bird's eye view, a high-level view of the Threema protocol. So we have the clients, the users, and the server. And the clients and the server communicate using this protocol, which we call the client-to-server protocol, or C2S for short. And on top, and this is for the client to communicate with the server. And on top of that, we have an end-to-end protocol, which allows users to communicate with each other. You have these two layers of encryption, which is a very standard thing to have for secure messaging applications. So we're going to go take a deep dive on these protocols. So let's start with the end-to-end protocol. Well, now each user has their own key pair, which you can imagine being this elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman share. And now assume that, for example, Alice has Bob's public key and vice versa. Then messages between Alice and Bob are encrypted under this key K, which is just a Diffie-Hellman between their long-term key. And I mean, you can immediately see that this has a problem. It doesn't have any forward secrecy, right? And we'll show how Threema actually handles this somewhat. And but first, let's take a look at how messages are sent in Threema. Whenever you send a message, you have to first serialize it and then encrypt it, and then after that you send it. But let's see how it's serialized. Well, first of all, we get a byte, which is the message type. And for example, for text messages, this is simply a 1 in the example that you see above. And then you have the message content. In this case, you have hello. And then you have a random amount of PKCS7 padding. In this example, it's just a 0202, and the reason behind this is that this tries to hide the length of the message. Then this whole thing gets encrypted using Exalsa 20 poly 1305 with a random nonce and the key K that we described before. So again, Diffie-Hellman of long-term key of both users. And before all of this, the metadata is prepended. So for example, the source and the receiver of the message. But clearly just doing this is not enough because this metadata is not integrity protected. What Threema does, it creates this value called a metadata box. And it is created by taking a selection of the metadata and then encrypting it again with the same nonce and a key derived from the key K. And this is a pretty strange design where key is used both for encryption on the right and also for key derivation. Right? But this is not the strangest thing about this protocol. The strangest thing is that this metadata box is actually not even mandatory. Indeed, an attacker could just strip away this metadata box, and now the metadata is just not integrity protected anymore, which means that the metadata can be overwritten, and this enables some of the attacks in our paper. And now let's take a look at the client-to-server protocol. So, as we were saying before, the client-to-server protocol is used to, as the name implies, for the client to connect to the server. And this sort of fixes the issue of the end-to-end protocol. The end-to-end protocol is not forward secure. And this, by injecting some ephemeral randomness in the authenticated key exchange, this creates an ephemeral session key. And maybe this is not satisfying because it's just forward secrecy at the client-to-server level rather than the end-to-end level. But Threema says it's hard to do it at the end-to-end level. So, and also note that the key pair used for the client-to-server protocol are exactly the same as the one that the users use for the end-to-end protocol. Right, so I'll walk you through the C2S protocol, but I'm just going to skip over a lot of the details because they're not relevant. So now Alice uses her key, which is the same again as the end-to-end protocol, and the server has its own key pair. And this public key of the server, PKS, is stored on Alice's device because it's embedded within the application. Now, Alice and the server will create their ephemeral keys, and they will send it to each other, and that is not too relevant. But what is relevant is this message here, where Alice at some point will need to authenticate to the server. So what she does is she derives this key, K-session, which is just a Diffie-Hellman between the ephemeral keys. And she will also derive another key called K-vouch, which is just a Diffie-Hellman within the long-term keys. And finally, she creates this value, voucher or vouch box, which is the encryption under K-vouch of her ephemeral key. What this does intuitively is that it creates a binding between her ephemeral key and her long-term key, which is containing K-vouch, right? So ephemeral key is what is being encrypted, and K-vouch is what contains her long-term key. And this value is then sent to the server, and the server will check it, and then if the handshake goes well, then they have established this key session, which they will use as the session key to communicate between the client and the server. Now let's take a look at the issue with this protocol. Well, first of all, let's focus on the vouch box. So on the top, you see that there's a key derivation, which is just a Diffie-Hellman between the long-term key of Alice and the long-term key of the server, right? So this is just Diffie-Hellman, long-term, long-term. Below, you have the encryption under this key of an ephemeral value, or actually some value, right? But this is exactly the same pattern that we've seen on the end-to-end protocol. We have a Diffie-Hellman and then the encryption using the result of that Diffie-Hellman. In some sense, you can see that the structure of the messages at the end-to-end level and then at the C2S protocol, they sort of have some similarities. And one can but wonder what could go wrong. And what could go wrong is exactly this. So imagine that we can find a special key pair ESK EPK such that EPK has this shape. So it starts with a 1, and it ends with a 1, and in the middle we have sigma, which is just 30 bytes of UTF-8 valid string. So something that you can just copy and paste somewhere else, right, as a message. And now consider this run of the end-to-end protocol between Alice and the attacker, right? So this is the end-to-end protocol. Assume first that the attacker manages to somehow claim that his end-to-end public key is PKS. And PKS, again, is the C2S key of the server. This, of course, looks like an insane assumption because normally you should never be allowed to claim an arbitrary public key, especially if you don't know the private key corresponding to that. But bear with me for just a second. Now, assume that the adversary also convinces Alice to send sigma, the 30 bytes of UTF-8 before, to send sigma as a text message to the attacker. And this could be, for example, the result of social engineering, or perhaps you could think of a spam campaign where they say, send me this discount code and we'll give you something. And then if Alice obliges, then what she does is she derives this key for the end-to-end protocol, which is the Diffie Hellman between her long-term key and what she believes to be the long-term key of the attacker, in this case, PKS. And then she sends, possibly, the encryption under this key K of, well, a 1, because it's a message type. Again, this is a text message, which implies this 1 byte. Then the content of the message, which by definition is like the sigma, and possibly, because the PKCS7 padding is randomized in its length, this also could be a 1, and the probability of this happening is 1 over 254. Now, because of the first assumption that the attacker's public key is PKS, then this key that Alice has just derived is exactly the same as K-vouch in the client-to-server protocol. And the message that she just sent to the attacker is the encryption using K-vouch of exactly the EPK, the key that has this strange shape from before. And this means that this is a valid vouch box for a key to which the attacker knows the corresponding private key. This is basically a C2S and end-to-end cross-protocol attack. So we're using a message from the end-to-end protocol in order to break the client-to-server protocol. The implication of this attack is that sending a text message compromises client authentication forever. Indeed, what happens is that the attacker now authenticates as Alice, just sending the vouch box to the server and say, hey, I'm Alice, are there any new messages for me? And then the server would just reply, oh yeah, these are the messages, which are of course still end-to-end encrypted, but this completely leaks all the metadata for inbound messages to Alice. We call this attack vouch box forgery because basically we're just forging a vouch box. We have some loose ends, some issues that that I promised that I would discuss. And the first one would be how to find a suitable ephemeral key, EPK, a problem which we call getting that key. And the second problem is how do we claim the server's public key as ours, right? So how do we claim PKS as our public key, which we call the bamboozling? Well, first of all, how to get the key. So we have this shape for EPK, and this is not very easy to do. This actually, empirically, we discovered that this requires about 2 to the 51 keys to be explored. And because these are public key operations, this is actually pretty expensive. And what we did is we ran some quick estimates, and this would cost around $180,000 on AWS. And Kenny replied with, yikes, which is the only correct response to such a message. However, we did manage to find some optimizations, which means that some optimization and 8,000 course days later, we actually found this key. So you can see the secret key on the top, and at the bottom you have a public key, which has exactly the shape that we want. So it starts with a 1, it ends with a 1, and in the middle we have this very strange string that you can copy. There's a nice QR code that you can use. You can send it to our account, and maybe you get hacked. Next problem, the bamboozling. Well, it's very hard to claim an arbitrary public key as yours, but Threema, much like a good Swiss cheese, it has holes. And the hole that we found is called Threema Gateway. And Threema Gateway is this sort of paid API, which is used in order for companies to programmatically send and receive messages from their client. And somehow you have this web API, which allows you to register a new account, and you put your public key, but it does not require you to prove that you have the corresponding private key. This is a nice oversight, which allowed us to create an account called LYTAAS. Up there, you see that the public key of LYTAAS is that one, and on the bottom, you see a screenshot from the code of Threema, and you can see that actually corresponding. So that server pub key is actually the key that we claimed to be from our account. You might ask, what does LYTAAS stand for? It stands for Lose Your Threema Account as a Service. And now we have all the ingredients to run this attack.
So for the second part of this talk, let me take over and go through some of the backup methods that Trima uses. In particular, I will cover Trima Safe. When you use Trima Safe, your identity, your private key, and a list of your contacts, including their nickname, gets encoded in JSON, zipped, encrypted with a password of your choosing, and sent to the Trima server for safekeeping. And then you can retrieve them from the Trima servers if you lose your device, for instance. And I'm sure that this audience can spot something wrong with this picture. And I will reveal it now. It's compressed and encrypted. So if crime on TLS taught us anything, is that if we first compress and then encrypt something, we are leaking information about the plaintext, especially if the plaintext changes, then the length of the encryption leaks something about it. And in this case, we're lucky because the attacker has a way to make the plaintext change, because the nickname of an account that could be controlled by the attacker is included in the backup. So now we have like this very nice crime-style setting, and we can exploit it in practice by creating this loop. So we can connect our target device to a computer with ADB, with the Android debug tools, start Trima. Trima will automatically start a backup of which we can observe the size. We will then drop the connection in order to make the backup fail. Otherwise, the Trima app would not attempt another backup for 7 days. Change the nickname of the attacker-controlled account, kill Trima, and repeat. And we observe that if we do this 16,000 times and observe all the backup sizes, then we have enough information to recover most of the private key, and then we can use Pollar's law to recover the remaining bits. So this gives us the private key through a compression side channel, which is wonderful, if you ask me. So this is the full list of the attacks that we found on Trima. We only covered 2 today. For the others, please check out our paper. They've all been fixed by Trima with a set of changes ranging from changes in the vouchbox derivation through better key separation, and of course for the backups, disabling compression. So now this has been very fun exercise in cryptanalysis, but what I want to discuss now is the wider lessons that we can learn from something like Trima. I think the first lesson concerns rolling your own protocol. We have a crypto mantra that is, don't roll your own crypto. We believe that this should be extended to no rolling of protocols allowed. We can see that Trima used mostly standard crypto, a crypto that we know to be safe, so the Knuckle library. But using Knuckle didn't save Trima. For instance, the metadata box is a good, perfectly safe authenticated encryption of the metadata, but at the protocol level, it could just be stripped. And the same for the vouchbox. Again, we have secure authenticated encryption, but this value does not contain freshness, therefore can be replied. So the guarantees that these primitives give are practically void at the protocol level. Much worse, not only you should not roll your own protocol, even modifying solid protocols in unintended ways can lead to bad consequences. This is the case for Bridgify, for instance. Bridgify is an offline messaging app. They use the Signal protocol, so we could expect them to be secure. But because of the way they implement the Signal protocol, they integrate it in their system, there is still an attack against Bridgify that allows man in the middle and therefore recover of plain text. Our second lesson concerns cross-protocol interactions. So for Trima, we saw two of these. One was the one that Ken just presented. We can take an end-to-end protocol message and play it in the C2S protocol to obtain a permanent authentication break. Another that we didn't talk about is a cross-protocol attack between the registration protocol and the end-to-end protocol. In this case, a malicious Trima server can use the registration protocol to produce compromising material that then can be played inside the E2E protocol. But we are not the only ones finding this kind of attacks in crypto in the wild. So for instance, Metrix is another messenger, a federated double ratchet-based messenger, and it suffered a devastating blow in its security through an attack that also exploits the interactions between old and Megal, and these are two sub-protocols inside Metrix. And finally, I want to stress the importance of proactive security. So if yesterday's talk about breaking cloud encryption and mobile networks and wireless were not enough, Trima starts with this very simple and traditional layering of protocol, so secure transport protocol and an end-to-end messaging protocol on top of that. But then it makes it much more complicated to formally analyzing by having forward secrecy only at the transport level. And furthermore, the end-to-end protocol was patched several times to add things like the metadata box and replay prevention for repeated nonces. And when Trima announced that they were releasing a forward secure protocol as an update after our findings, we were very surprised to see that they were not releasing a new, fresh end-to-end protocol, but they were stacking a new protocol on top of the existing ones. So here we are entering the uncanny valley of formal verification, and I'm very glad I won't be the one trying to make a formal model out of this. And I am sincerely afraid to imagine what will happen if they try to add post-compromise security to their system. So to recap, don't roll your own protocols. And if you really have to, beware of cross-protocol interactions. And please prove your protocol secure before some PhD students comes and breaks it. Naturally, this begs the question of who should take this heavy and expensive load of designing, proving secure, and maintaining cryptographic protocols. I don't have an answer for this, but maybe you have opinions. And with this, I want to close the talk. You can drop us an email or visit our website for the full paper. Thank you for your attention, and we will be happy to take your questions.
I'm afraid we're out of time, so we will have to move on to the next speaker, but I encourage you to follow up afterwards. So our next speaker is Julia Len, who will be speaking about interoperability in end-to-end encrypted messaging.
Thank you for the introduction. I'm excited to present to you today on interoperability and end-to-end encrypted messaging, and this is joint work with Escher Ghosh, Paul Grubbs, and Paul Rissler. And so end-to-end encrypted messaging has become arguably one of the most widely used privacy technologies today. It's used across many messaging apps, including WhatsApp, Signal, and iMessage, among others. And most popular messaging apps follow a centralized model. So generally this means that users of a particular messaging app can only message users of that same app. So for example here, a Signal user cannot message somebody on WhatsApp. But a recent ruling from the EU will mean major changes to this model for secure messaging. So in particular, last September, the EU signed into law the Digital Markets Act, or DMA. Now, the goal of this regulation is to reduce the effect of large gatekeeper companies, essentially those that control a majority of the market share for messaging, from locking in users into their messaging ecosystem due to network effects. And so one important provision of the DMA is a mandate that these large gatekeeper apps must make their services interoperable with non-gatekeeper apps upon request. And so some of you may be thinking that this doesn't affect you if you're outside of the EU, but I will add that this has the potential to affect those outside of the EU as well. For one thing, we've seen historically that laws in the EU tend to set precedents for regulation outside the EU, which we've seen with the GDPR. And for example, the US has already proposed a similar regulation requiring interoperability through the Access Act of 2021. So really, this is a regulation that has the potential for affecting all future end-to-end encrypted messaging. So going back to our model here, where WhatsApp is very likely to be designated a gatekeeper app. As an illustrative example here, if a non-gatekeeper like Signal requests to interoperate with WhatsApp, then Signal users would be able to message WhatsApp users without making a WhatsApp account. And this represents a fundamental change to the basic centralized architecture of today's end-to-end encrypted messaging. And very naturally, this raises a lot of questions. For instance, how will this interoperability look like? What's the design space here? And how exactly will this affect security and privacy? And complicating this further is the fact that the DMA sets out an initial deadline of March 2024, in just about a year from now, to have all of this figured out. So to better understand this, I want to address some of the challenges that arise in this interoperability setting. In today's ecosystem, two service providers will have made completely different design choices. So for instance, one service provider could use phone numbers for user IDs, while another could use email. One could use Signal's double ratchet algorithm for the end-to-end encrypted protocol, while another could use MT-Proto. And furthermore, if some sender is malicious and sends an abusive message, then different providers might have different policies in place for how to handle this. So both recipients here might report the same message, but one provider does not view this as a violation, while another does, and therefore blocks the user from their platform. And currently, these different design choices don't complicate messaging. But now with interoperability, the barrier between service providers are going to be porous. And so unlike other interoperable communication systems like SMS, aside from not being end-to-end encrypted, we're having to retrofit systems and protocols together that were not originally designed to be interoperable. And so one way to make this work is just to completely give up on end-to-end encryption in favor of interoperability. But we strongly advocate against this and think we can do better. So given the DMA and its mandate, and the timeline given here, the goal of our work and this talk is to understand how can the existing components of widely used end-to-end encrypted messaging apps be extended to be interoperable. So to do this, I'll first give a quick overview of the DMA's interoperability requirements, and I'll add a quick disclaimer here that we're not legal experts, but our interpretation here is guided by legal discussions where possible. Next, we'll look more closely at three core components of messaging affected by the DMA, which are identity systems, end-to-end encrypted protocols, and abuse prevention. And we'll describe some of the solutions possible here. And next, I'll describe some of the open questions remaining in the setting. And also, while at first glance, this all may seem like a major security and privacy disaster, I'll try to convince you of the somewhat counterintuitive conclusion here that we came across in this work, that interoperability could be a huge opportunity to actually improve the privacy of end-to-end encrypted messaging. So with that in mind, let's take a look at the timeline set by the DMA. This May, the DMA rules will begin to apply. Then by this July, potential gatekeepers will need to notify the European Commission that their service meets the threshold, at which point by September, the European Commission will need to designate service providers as the gatekeepers. And so they'll use metrics like market capitalization, number of users, and annual revenue to determine this. And then that brings us to March 2024, in just about a year, when designated gatekeeper apps will need to enable interoperability, which is a fairly ambitious timeline. Now, the DMA's interoperability requirements are mainly spelled out in Article 7, which says that these so-called gatekeeper apps must provide the necessary technical interface or equivalent to enable interoperability with another provider upon request and free of charge. So the article also does make explicit some of the basic requirements here. After designation, a gatekeeper will need to make text messaging and sharing of media files interoperable between two users. After 2 years, they'll need to extend this functionality to group messaging. And then after 4 years, they'll need to extend interoperability to voice and video calls. And while I don't have time to get into all of the rules set by Article 7, there are a couple of paragraphs that are important here to understand. The first is paragraph 3, which states that the level of security, including end-to-end encryption, that the gatekeeper provides to its own end users should be preserved for cross-platform messages. Also, only the personal data of end users that is strictly necessary should be collected and exchanged by interoperating providers. And finally, paragraph 9 states that the gatekeeper is allowed to take measures to stop risk to integrity, security, and privacy of its services as long as these measures are strictly necessary. And so we interpret this specific paragraph as saying that gatekeepers are allowed to implement abuse prevention measures. But of course, this raises questions about what data should be kept private from interoperating service providers, and what data are they allowed to demand about end users in order to implement abuse prevention measures? What exactly here is strictly necessary? So to address these questions and challenges, we're going to take a closer look at these 3 core components of messaging here. Before we directly get into that, I want to first describe the design choices for the system architecture which affect these components. So let's consider the example here where we have Alice and Bob who want to communicate, and Alice is on the service provider Alice Chat while Bob is on a different service provider, Bob Chat. So there are 2 major ways that the communication flows can happen here. The first is that Alice directly sends communication to Bob Chat, who then forwards to Bob. And so we call this the client to server model. One benefit is that Alice Chat does not learn that Alice is communicating with somebody on Bob Chat. However, it has some drawbacks, including that Alice would need some way to authenticate herself to Bob Chat as an authorized user, and also that abuse prevention techniques like server-side spam filtering might be more challenging here. And so the other option is to have Alice continue to send messages to Alice Chat, which will then forward communication to Bob Chat on Alice's behalf. We call this the server-to-server model, and we use this in our design. So there is the drawback here that it leaks to Alice Chat that Alice is talking to someone on Bob Chat, and to Bob Chat that Bob is talking to someone on Alice Chat. However, we feel that the benefits of this model outweigh these drawbacks, including that network level metadata like IP address of users is not leaked in cross-provider communication to other providers. And additionally, this will make implementing certain abuse prevention measures easier. So with that in mind, let's take a look at identity discovery and interoperability. Let's continue with our example where Alice wants to initiate communication with Bob. The first step would be that Alice needs some way to learn which app Bob is on. And so this would be called service discovery. We won't cover this in our talk, but we do cover this in our paper. I'll also add that this is not required by the DMA, but we think that this will be important. So then to initiate communication, Alice will need some way to retrieve Bob's keying material from BobChat. And one really trivial option here is just to have all users register with every provider. So each provider knows everybody else's identity, including those on other providers. In this example, then, Alice can just query her own provider Alice chat for Bob's key, just as in the centralized setting. Of course, this is a complete privacy disaster, since now each provider also knows the user base of every other provider. So this also violates at least the spirit of the DMA, if not the letter of the law, and we advocate against this. So instead, in our solution, we have senders make encrypted queries to the other provider's identity system. Here, Alice encrypts a query for Bob's key to BobChat and sends this to Alice Chat, who won't be able to decrypt and therefore won't know what Alice is querying for. Alice Chat can forward this query to BobChat, who can decrypt, retrieve Bob's keying material, and encrypt that for Alice, which is then forwarded back to Alice via Alice Chat. So finally, Alice can decrypt to recover Bob's keying material. And so the security goals we want to target here are that Alice Chat should not learn that Alice is querying for Bob, and also BobChat should not learn that Alice is the one querying for Bob's keying material. Next, for the protocol layer interoperability, now that Alice has Bob's keying material, Alice needs to know how to encrypt the message in order to deliver this to Bob. So what protocol does Alice use here? Well, one option that we've seen proposed is to use a server-side bridge to translate between protocols. So Alice would continue using the protocol as specified by Alice Chat, but then Alice Chat would implement a server-side bridge to decrypt this communication and re-encrypt it using BobChat's protocol. However, this solution asks us to completely give up on end-to-end encryption, since obviously now the providers can learn the communication. So obviously this is not a solution that we want to target. Another solution that's been proposed is that everybody uses a standardized protocol. And while this might work in the long term, standardization can be a really time-consuming process, and we're working with a very short deadline here of just about a year. So we also don't see this as a solution in the short term. The solution that we do see likely, at least in the short term, is that gatekeeper apps will fix a protocol that other providers will need to speak. Then non-gatekeeper apps will include the gatekeeper implementation in their app through client bridges. There are, of course, also some drawbacks here, namely that if an app has to include an implementation of every gatekeeper that they're interoperating with, this could get very expensive. Also, if some gatekeeper implementation has a vulnerability, suddenly this is spread to lots of other apps potentially. But in the short term, we still believe that this is more likely the solution here. I also want to add that our design includes a sender anonymous wrapper over the base encryption protocol to hide Alice's identity from BobChat. We specifically use an extension of signal sealed sender protocol, so this means that BobChat does not learn Alice's identity, except for when Alice is initiating conversations with a new message partner. And so our security goals here are the more typical messaging goals of confidentiality and authenticity. But we also have some unique privacy goals here as well, which are that BobChat, whenever possible, should not learn that Alice is the one messaging Bob, and also Alice Chat, wherever possible, should not learn Bob is Alice's recipient. So finally, we'll take a quick look at the flows for abuse prevention. And obviously, this is a fairly complex topic, and there are a variety of mechanisms that could be deployed, but we specifically focus here on more widely deployed mechanisms. So those are spam filtering, user reporting, and block listing. Well, so generally one option for abuse prevention is don't do anything and don't address it. But we think abuse prevention is valuable and should be integrated with any designs that are proposed as part of a holistic protocol. And well, the other trivial option that we've seen proposed is just to give BobChat all the metadata about senders from Alice Chat. But this would be hugely bad for privacy, since now BobChat learns about users on other providers. So instead, we offer some designs that involve abuse prevention mechanisms, while also trying to minimize this metadata leakage. Now, there's specifically concern that with this interoperability mandate, there'll be an increase in spam. So having spam filtering in place will be really important here. And many apps use server-side spam filters to have the provider identify traffic that is likely to be spam based on metadata and block it. So a benefit of our model is that we could have Alice Chat run the spam filter on the sender's traffic before forwarding it to Bob Chat. Alice Chat already knows the metadata about users on its platform. And so it can use this to filter spam without leaking extra metadata to Bob Chat, who might be concerned about an increase of spam incoming to its platform. And for example, based on the DMA, gatekeepers could require other providers to run spam filters on their end as a condition for interoperating. Next, for user reporting, we use an asymmetric message ranking scheme to enable secure metadata private content moderation. In our design, Alice, as part of the ciphertext, includes a message ranking tag to authenticate the message so that Bob Chat can act as a moderator. Then, if Alice's message is deemed abusive by Bob and Bob wants to report it, he would send the contents of the message ranking tag, and that Alice was the sender to Bob Chat, who could then choose to act on this and can verify the franking tag. So for example, Bob Chat could ask Alice Chat to block any messages coming from Alice to its platform. And finally, for block listing, the overall flow would work similar to reporting. In our design, we have Bob reveal Alice's user ID to Bob Chat so that Bob Chat can block future communication from Alice to Bob. Overall, security goals here are that we want to target user reporting that's verifiable, but we also want to minimize metadata leakage here. So now that we've given some highlights of the core areas in our design, let's look at some of the open directions left here to explore. So the first question is, how do we improve the privacy of interoperable end-to-end encryption by reducing metadata leakage in this setting? Also, how do we extend other protocols used in end-to-end encrypted messaging, like key transparency, for instance, into this interoperability setting? And finally, how do we extend our framework and analyses to group chats and encrypted calls, which will also be required by the DMA? And so to conclude here, interoperability clearly presents lots of challenges and open questions in this space. But rather than being a burden, we can actually use interoperability as an opportunity to design encrypted messaging with more privacy. So what do I mean here? In particular, interoperability by design forces service providers who we believe are non-colluding to split up their view of communication. And with some work here, we can make it so that neither server has a full view of the communication flow or user metadata. And so one idea here, for instance, is that we could even make centralized messaging more private by building inexpensive anonymizing proxies using interoperability. So if you want more details about our work, I have the link to our paper on the slide. Thank you for listening. I'm happy to take any questions.
Hi, so your proposal is that the non-gatekeeper app has to kind of, in some sense, embed the protocol of the gatekeeper app within it, in some sense, yeah? So, so I saw this as, there's like a pro and a con to this, is that on one hand, the non-gatekeeper app has to now be much more protocol agile, in the sense that the gatekeeper app can change the protocol and the non-gatekeeper app has to kind of update, which could be good, because that means the non-gatekeeper app has to be crypto agile in a way that they haven't been before. So that's like a good thing. On the other hand, the gatekeeper app could just keep changing the protocol, which kind of could act like a denial of service. So do you see that's a, you know, the pro, what have you thought about that kind of agility issue in your work at all?
So I think there is some stipulation in the DMA saying that like making it inaccessible for non-gatekeepers to allow for this would be in violation of the DMA. But I mean, that's an interesting question also, like how do you deal with this sort of crypto agility where we could have the gatekeeper app sort of implement these kinds of measures so that it makes it really hard for non-gatekeepers to. Yeah, exactly. So so it's an interesting question. How do we deal with this? I think that this would be sort of in violation of the DMA, and I think they could sort of like battle it out in courts most likely. But I mean, I think the future long term would be that we would have to sort of standardize something so to sort of prevent this. But there are interesting questions like this in the space.
I'm afraid we have to move on, so please join me in thanking Julia again. The next speaker in this session is Shu Katsumoto, who will be talking about metadata protection for MLS and its variants.
Thank you for the intro. My name is Shu. This is a joint work with Keitaro Hashimoto and Thomas Prest. So, yep, this is the title. So as everybody knows, everybody's using message apps lately, and you can see from the picture that there's a lot of users now. And the weird thing in Japan, everybody uses this obscure app called Line. I think outside of Japan, not a lot of people uses it. And WhatsApp is more of the more popular ones. And within this community, I think Signal is one of the favorite apps. So this is just a recap on that everybody uses messaging apps. So the thing is, when we think about messaging apps, it provides a lot of unique security threats. And one of the reasons is that messaging apps are mostly run on our smartphones. And that means that it's really deeply tied to our everyday lives. So once these contents and metadata that are run on our messaging apps leak, then it will leak a lot of our information. And not only our information, but also our friends, colleagues, anybody's these social relationships will kind of leak too. So in that sense, it's a very unique app. And also, compared to other TLS-based communication, like just web browsing, messaging apps tend to last much longer. So it means from the hacker's point of view, there's going to be a higher risk of a security breach. And also, when there is a security breach, then this insecurity is going to persist longer. And there's a lot of ways to kind of collect data from these messaging apps. And one way is to do from a legal means. So this is a Meta's transparency report from last year for half a year. And as you can see, it's really growing. The number of reports that the government asks of Meta is very increasing. And you can see that at least 75% of the time, some data are provided back to the government. So what this means is that, it's not like they're trying to give all these information to the government, but we have to be mindful that they can always leak our information if needed. And also, legal means are not the end of the story, because as some people may know, spyware are sold off the shelf by companies and hackers. So this Pegasus spyware, I think some people know, was a big incident. So this brings me to today's talk, which is about secure group messaging, and in particular, a scalable one. So first, I'll talk about a systematic view on what I mean by a secure messaging app. And then I'm going to compare Signal and MLS and show that MLS lacks some features that Signal has. And finally, I'll show how to bootstrap MLS to have this metadata hiding property, which makes it as secure as Signal. So let me first take a closer look at messaging protocols. So Alice wants to securely send a message to Bob, and here we have to be mindful that there has to be a server sitting in the middle. And the reason for this is that when you're thinking about messaging apps, nobody's online all the time on their phone. So maybe Bob is offline. In that case, when Alice sends a message, there has to be some entity that kind of stores it and relays it to Bob when it comes online again. So you could think of two adversaries here, the network adversary and the server adversary. And when I mean, server adversary, I'm not saying that they're, really trying to look into your data, but maybe they're just looking at it and they're storing in their server, and maybe governments can tell them to hand them over, or there could be a security breach. So it's just better to view them as an adversary in a theoretical sense. So first of all, removing outsider threats are really easy. We just use end-to-end encryption between the user and the server. So now nobody from the outside world can see, what the communication channel's up to. Also, removing this insider threat is, it's actually easy too. So we can just assume that Alice and Bob shares a secret key. Then they can just encrypt this message with this orange box and send it, and the server can't decrypt it anymore. And you can use like an authenticated key exchange to share this, establish this key. For instance, in Signal, we use the X3DH protocol to do that. So at this point, when I first started doing secure messaging, I thought end-to-end encryption was all that really matters. But this is actually not the case, because in practice, as I think people have been talking a lot, metadatas are also used. And at least for this talk, I define this metadata to be the identity and social relationships of group of users. So in this diagram, to be a bit more specific, let's say this MD stands for this bit string Alice to Bob. And the reason why we require this metadata is because when the server just receives this orange blob of ciphertext, it doesn't know what to do with it. So when Bob comes online, it can't do anything with it without this explicit metadata lying around. So Alice will specify in this bit string that it's for Bob. And this is how the server will be able to relay these messages to Bob. But now what happens is that the server learns who's trying to communicate with whom. So we might believe that metadata, maybe that's not really important, but it reveals more than you think. So this was in a very nice news article. And a former NSA General Counsel mentions that if you have enough metadata, you don't really need content. And when you think of it in the very extreme, let's say you're a journalist and you're talking to an activist, then that already explains a lot of the content. So maybe sometimes it might undermine the fact that you're using end-to-end encryption, because those relationships already defines what kind of content you're talking about. And what's more scary is that metadata collection can be done systematically. So there are these services that provide surveillance and technology for tracking metadata. So metadata are really important information that, well, we want to hide. So as a conceptual contribution, what we did was that we tried to categorize sensitive data that we want to hide into 3 layers. So here, the first layer is very, very obvious. So, it's supposed to be hidden for any end-to-end encryption secure messaging service. So the message has to be encrypted. We call that the first layer. The second layer is the explicit metadata that I was talking about. So this has to be, well, we believe that this is required to, make the server relay these messages. And the third layer is a bit more subtle, but when you think about it, is as equally as important as the second layer. But the third layer is this user-server authenticated channel. And this implicitly leaks metadata, because when the user connects to the server, well, the server gets to know who's connecting. So even if this second layer information wasn't there, when this Alice uploads this orange blob, and Bob at a later point authenticate itself to the server and retrieve this orange blob, then it will learn that this blob was moved from Alice to Bob. So it will actually learn the second layer information, even though it's not explicitly there. And one might think that you can use anonymous channels like Tor or VPN to do this authentication on the bottom line, but you really can't do that, because with anonymous channels, you can perform a DOS attack. So anybody can just send garbage elements to Bob without the server being able to catch who it was doing. So when we talk about hiding our sensitive data, we want to really hide all these first to third layers and have a secure scheme. So in that light, I want to kind of go into the current state of secure messaging. So Signal protocol, this is something that everybody I think knows very well. It's a gold standard for 2-user messaging. And its protocol and a variation of its protocol are used within Signal, WhatsApp, Skype, the list goes on. And you can also use the Signal protocol in the group setting. And here, sending a message scales with order n, where n is the number of users. So this kind of sparked some interest in the community that can we make this more efficient, because we don't want to pay this order n cost. And this was the beginning of the messaging layer security protocol, MLS. So it is a scalable solution to secure messaging. And there's an ITF that was driven by academics and industry, and we're in the final stage of of standardization. And the draft versions of MLS has already been used in Cisco's WebEx and RingCentral. The main key feature of MLS is that it's supposed to be secure as the Signal protocol and in spirit. And let me kind of like focus on what I mean by in spirit. So let's take a closer look and see what they do on these like first, second, and third layers. So for Signal, it covers all these layers. So you have this vanilla Signal protocol that only cover this first layer, but after a while we had sealed sender private groups that eventually covered all of these third layers. So it's also secure against network adversaries. But for MLS, what we have right now is that we have MLS plaintext and MLS ciphertext. So MLS has two modes. And MLS plaintext covers the first layer. And this is where most of the academic works on security proofs have been. So we also have MLS ciphertext that secures the second layer. But when we go up the third layer, there's really no protection there. And this is completely fine because it was out of the scope for MLS. But we have to really think about this when we're going to deploy this MLS and claim that it's going to be secure as Signal. So this is our main contribution. What we did is that we made MLS as secure as Signal by providing the first protocol to secure up until the third layer. And we also provided the first security definition, security model, and a security proof to kind of complement these constructions. And this work was done at CCS last year. So if anybody is interested in the nitty-gritty details, I recommend reading the ePrint paper. But let me try to give a taste of our construction in the last 3 or 4 minutes. So this is our metadata hiding MLS, and the core idea is very simple. We just use this unique, continuously evolving group secret key shared among the group of users. So this is something non-existing in Signal. And this bootstraps any MLS-like protocol to be metadata hiding. And when I mean MLS-like protocol, so it doesn't have to be MLS. It could be all these other variants that tries to optimize MLS in different aspects. So it's not, as long as there's this unique group secret key shared among the groups, then you can apply this idea. It's generic, simple, efficient, and you can also have post-quantum on top of that. And the overhead is really small, so it's only one signature per message. So it adds a lot of security with with no overhead. So the idea is very simple at a high level, so let me share that with you. So we have a group secret key that's shared among all the users. What we do is that we derive a signing key from this group secret. And we're going to give this verification key to the server, and all these users on the left side, when they want to contact the server, what they do is that they just sign with this signing key, which is shared among all the group of users. And they're going to do this over an anonymous channel. So the authentication part comes from this signature, and it provides like a group membership proof. And this is how they prove that they're a group member, but nothing more about their identity. And the good thing about this is that since we're using this group secret key that's based on this MLS layer, we have for secrecy, post-compromise, security, we have all these nice guarantees. We can also rotate this group secret key, and hence rotating this signature keys too. And for those who knows about this topic very well, there's a lot of variants of MLS that offers better efficiency. And one of the important one is using selective downloading, and our idea can be applied to theirs by further deriving secret permutation of group members from this group secret key. And when I mentioned that this works for any MLS-like protocol, we tried to formulate that into the security model too to make it modular. So what we do is that we provide an idealized MLS-like protocol, and we view our group membership proof as a wrapper protocol. So we can kind of slap on this wrapper protocol on any idealized protocol, and we prove security of that. So if somebody wants to use our model, then you could just slap on your favorite MLS-like protocol into this idealized model, and you get a security out of that. So as a summary, what we did is that we tried to make MLS-like protocol metadata hiding by kind of making it more aligned with what Signal offers. And this is just the food for thought, but for the next step, I think once MLS is finished with the standardization, there's going to be a lot of more interest in using it in the real world. However, as you know, everybody's been talking, there's always a tension between regulation and end-to-end encryption nowadays. So right now, this work really focuses on how secure can we make it for the users. But maybe we really have to think about these content moderation to some extent. I'm not, trying to forfeit end-to-end encryption, but there has to be some moderation maybe. And in that case, we really have to think about what's the right balance and all that. Until then, I don't think we'll be able to deploy this for everybody. But I'm optimistic that there has to be some nice balancing. Thank you.
One quick question.
Yes. Do you mind going back to your slide about your solution? Yeah, so I see once the group is constructed that it would be metadata hiding, but isn't metadata leaked when you actually create this group? So negotiation?
Right, so you can actually use other protocols to hide that part. So when you're adding group of users in this MLS-like protocol, you have this welcome message, which is actually a two-user communication. And for that, we can use like some other protocols to perform that part.
What other protocols?
So Orca could be one famous, recent protocol from Usenix that does these metadata hidings. Or you can also use Signal's protocol, like the two-user protocol, to hide this. You could use sealed sender, for instance. So you could use those for the two-user communication. And after that, with the group version, you can use this group secret key to perform more efficient metadata hiding protocols.
Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. The final talk in this session is on real-world deniability in messaging and will be given by Daniel Collins.
Okay, hello everyone. I'm Daniel, and this is joint work with Simone and Lois at EPFL. So this is about deniability. So firstly, what is deniability? So in essence, to quote Moxie Marlinspike, if someone receives, basically if you're receiving a message, you can be sure that sort of the person who sent it to you sent it, that is to say you have some authenticity, but crucially, you cannot prove to anyone else that it was something you wrote. So concretely, take two parties, Alice and Bob, who are communicating. So let's say Alice says something to Bob that Bob not only doesn't approve of, but maybe wants to give this as evidence or something to some kind of judge to basically frame Alice. So Bob sends let's say his phone, or gives his phone to the judge. So this conversation would then be deniable for Alice if, essentially from the perspective of the judge, this sort of conversation transcript or whatever is given to the judge could have been sort of simulated by Bob, or basically forged by Bob. So this is kind of the broad framework that we'll kind of consider deniability in hereafter. So in the cryptographic literature, it's claimed by sort of various different types of primitives and protocols, usually key exchange, since the 90s. There's many flavors of deniability, depending, say, on the power of the judge. So I think perhaps since its sort of inception that there's sort of been some debate about exactly how relevant deniability is. So in this talk, we'll basically sort of look at a few little case studies, both from a technical perspective, but also a legal and sort of social perspective, to basically conclude that sometimes there are problems with deniability. And then we sort of propose a little solution that maybe could help to sort of improve practical deniability. But then again, we ask, is this even desirable? Good, so we first zoom in on Signal. So we've heard a bit about Signal recently. So this uses sort of X2DH and the double ratchet for messaging. So indeed, it's claimed that sort of the key exchange protocol X2DH provides some deniability. So there's many recent works that consider this. So both the deniability of Signal itself, sort of X2DH itself, but also sort of to construct, say, more deniable or post-quantum secure X2DH-like protocols. So in a recent work, several authors show that sort of indeed in some model that X2DH is deniable. And that if X2DH is deniable, they then have some kind of little composition theorem that shows that sort of double ratchet, the messaging protocol, is also deniable. So somehow, therefore, the entire communication is deniable, which is good, because that's what we want. But in practice, there are several things going on top of the X2DH and double ratchet. So things like groups, sort of multi-device. And one particular thing is sort of the authentication that's done with the server on top. So we claim here that sort of this use of authentication sort of harms deniability in practice. And this would also apply to sort of basically independent of the crypto somehow. So if you plug in these other schemes that somehow deniability is also lost. So maybe let's see why. So we consider the regular authentication first. So let's suppose Alice is trying to communicate with Bob. Basically, Alice will authenticate with the server, send a ciphertext to Bob, and also send the identity of the receiver, Bob, to the server. The server then forwards that on to Bob. And so the crucial thing here is sort of the server, assuming it's honest, is authenticating Alice and Bob. So let's now assume that sort of Bob is trying to frame Alice. So if a judge takes a phone from Bob, basically the judge can reasonably conclude one of two things. Either that sort of, if Bob basically sort of acted honestly and received this message from the judge, from Alice, and so basically Alice communicated, or else Bob somehow modified his phone and was able to basically try and frame Alice. So in some sense, the deniability that Alice attains is sort of dependent on Bob's technical expertise, which is a bit sort of backwards, but, and of course this is worse if the server is sort of colluding even more with the judge. In Signal's case, this is relatively good. And now we then move to sealed sender. So of course the idea of sealed sender is to try and hide the identity of the sender, that is to say Alice here, from the server. So in this mode, two things are done. Firstly, in order to authenticate with the server without actually directly authenticating with the server, Alice will get a token from Bob somehow. Alice will also get sort of a token, sort of a certificate that Bob can then check later that sort of certifies that Alice indeed can communicate with Bob. So when sending a message, Alice will send the token and alongside a ciphertext, and the ciphertext encrypts the certificate that I just mentioned. So the server will check, make sure the token's okay. If everything's good, the ciphertext forwarded to Bob. And then Bob can check that the certificate looks okay. So as a remark, this is enabled by default by between mutual contacts. So I suppose quite a lot of communication on Signal. And as we've seen, this depends on the network adversary. So like the sealed sender functionality somehow depends, its security depends on the network adversary's power. But of course, so again, we have this sort of problem where like if Bob gives sort of the phone to the judge, let's say this, like if this mode of authentication is used, then if Bob sort of either provides the certificate or sort of is honest and used this mode of authentication, then the only, like the certificate basically binds Alice to this communication or some kind of recent communication, because the certificate is sort of periodically obtained from the server. So somehow this certainly limits Alice's deniability. So in this sort of intuitive sense of deniability, at least, it's not the ideal situation. But even notwithstanding, maybe we should ask in practice, like to what extent is deniability sort of used? So maybe this, is okay. So one little case study that we look at is for court cases. So a very natural sort of application of deniability. And so we look at some openly accessible case data, in particular in sort of some cantons in French-speaking Switzerland. So in the literature, I guess, there was no mention of Signal, but we found several mentions of WhatsApp. And in these cases, we were only able to find one sort of failed challenge to a transcript, communication transcript's validity. So in general, communication transcripts that consisted of screenshots were also often admitted and so on. So in terms of Signal, I think we've seen relatively recently that Signal has appeared in some cases, in high-profile cases, and as far as I know, could be wrong. So, like it seems like the evidence has sort of been seemingly successfully uncontested. So somehow this is a microcosm of sort of deniability, maybe not being used everywhere in practice, at least in a legal sense. So maybe why? So a lack of awareness about sort of the notion of cryptographic deniability. So perhaps this is somehow a technical notion. So in some cases, many cases, evidence doesn't really consider sort of phone transcripts, so trivially this somehow doesn't apply. And in a legal system, somehow sort of, if someone's trying to forge evidence, then it's more of sort of there's sort of social barriers or sort of legal barriers to sort of being able to pass off evidence as sort of forged, like in particular due to like being illegal. So in some situations, this is the case. But we can then ask can we maybe sort of improve the state of affairs? So can we make deniability sort of catch on? So indeed, in some cases, phones reveal a lot to a judge. And as we've seen, sort of parties can try to claim that they can sort of that evidence has been tampered with, or that basically, the phone has been tampered with. But somehow this is kind of a strange, like a difficult argument to mount, because somehow you need to be able to sort of modify your Signal app or whatever. So one solution is essentially to potentially to basically you take the sort of an app like Signal, and basically you provide users with the ability to sort of edit, send and receive messages. So basically whenever a phone is handed over, for example, this would basically somehow deniability is sort of evident from this. So in a recent concurrent work, several authors actually performed sort of a study where they basically try to work out sort of perceptions of deniability in practice. And they basically, in particular, gave some participants a tool to basically do this. And it seems like it basically improved sort of deniability in practice. So somehow this complements sort of the suggestion. But one may ask, do we even want deniability? So I guess, firstly, it could be used to protect people, so people that we want to protect. But of course, it could be also used to use by, like, say, powerful people to basically, protect them. So somehow there's always this trade-off. And in proportion to how much practical deniability you have, I guess both of these things are kind of amplified, which certainly is problematic from the side of the cons. So to conclude, if we're interested in making a deniable system, I guess there's a few different things we can consider. So the first is sort of exactly what kind of adversary we're defending against. So as we've seen, perhaps a cryptographic adversary in sort of a restricted sense is not enough. And even within these, maybe some models are a bit too sort of strong. So notwithstanding for adoption purposes, phone numbers are useful, but in the sense that you're registering sort of with a service provider using something like a phone number, somehow this limits deniability inherently. It seems that sort of a more practical or explainable notion of deniability is a much more sort of useful thing than sort of not to say technical deniability is not useful, but than this. And of course, the less information that a judge gets, the better. So to minimize metadata, or metadata hiding, as we've seen, is very important. And to take that one step further, maybe there are some applications where anonymity itself may be more desirable. So maybe deniability can be avoided. And just to wrap up, finally, we have an ePrint paper where basically we propose a model sort of on top of this, kind of not quite a cryptographic model, but something nevertheless. But I'd be very interested to hear sort of and encourage some sort of discussion and debate on this topic. It seems like it's cropped up a lot, and yeah, it'd be useful to clarify. So thank you for listening.
Hi, yeah, thank you for looking at all the aspects regarding deniability. There are really so many facets to it. For context, I'm one of the authors of the MLS protocol, and we discussed it a lot at length.
I've seen on the mailing list.
Yeah. So I've always been on the side of leaning towards, saying that deniability is a good property to have. But it's actually incredibly complex. It's certainly not black and white. And what you pointed out is that you can have it at the protocol level, and that's true for the Signal protocol. There's even an academic proof now. But in practice, it maybe doesn't give you what you think it does. You already mentioned that on a layer above, you can sort of invalidate that already. But even on the protocol level, there are two aspects to that. So one is that for protocols who are not deniable, like PGP, where you have a signature, or MLS, where you also have a signature, in most messaging systems, the ciphertext and the signatures are thrown away after you receive a message. So they're not kept. So in that sense, only the plaintext is kept, and that is completely deniable again. So you would have to assume that if an attacker wants to frame a user, they would have to use a different client, like a modified app, essentially.
Yeah, so I just to interrupt briefly, I guess sort of in practice, it seems like a lot of the time sort of basically screenshots of what appears to be plain text is admitted as evidence to somehow.
Right, that anyway, but say, for example, if you wanted to frame someone with a signature, then you would have to have a modified app that keeps the signature after receiving the message. So if you start from that vantage point and you assume that someone makes the effort of downloading a modified app, And then you can actually also attack the Signal protocol on that level, because you can run it, I think, inside an SGX enclave. And then you have sort of a proof that a message was received.
Yeah.
So even though academically speaking, the protocol is perfect in terms of deniability, you can still attack it at that level as well. So after a few years of looking into that, my question is, can we ever really achieve deniability at all levels? And I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I've worked a bit on the topic sort of more from a theoretical perspective, but I would agree that it seems like there are several sort of attacks that sort of seem to crop up over time that basically, like for example, using a trusted execution environment or sort of having some kind of proof of like non-participation or something like that. These things are always seem to be possible. So I guess in some restricted circumstances, it seems deniability is sort of possible, particularly kind of in this offline versus online deniability. But obviously in the worst case, I guess not. So I think it depends. Cool.
Thank you.
That's all right.
So I guess my question is, do you think we are over-indexing on overly paranoid threat models, either court of law with a judge or the like super secret, I'm running something in SGX? Because we've seen these problems with, say, the US presidential election and leaked emails being authenticated to DKIM with the French presidential election. Is it maybe a broader context of people posting messages online or later forensically data being found? Does that change how you'd view this?
So, sorry, could you clarify the question briefly again? Sorry.
So the model you put up in this talk is like you're going to a judge.
Oh yes.
And that tends to be the starting point. I mean, we used it as the survey in the paper too.
Yeah.
But the real motivation for these things these days is people like hack and leak operations, information being posted online.
Yeah.
And you don't want it to be trivial to verify that messages are there.
So I guess, sometimes it's not even relevant to have cryptographic deniability. So I guess something like maybe WikiLeaks, it seems like, they sort of take just like text and they have some kind of internal sort of verification protocol, but then they'll post a bunch of sort of dumps. And even though there's not signatures attached to it, people will still people will still take it as sort of true. So maybe like, I guess it depends on sort of exactly which cases you're considering, but I mean, I think certainly there is sort of a big mismatch between sort of the theory and the practice on this.
I mean, it's
Okay,
specific.
sorry, we'll need to wrap up here. But thank you very much. All right, now it's time for a coffee break, and we'll resume at 3:50.